Hi, it's Sarah, and today I'm just going to talk to you for a few minutes about culture, what it is, and why it matters. So, it's a word that we use a lot in everyday language. We hear in all different kinds of contexts, but we don't always take time to think about what actually we mean when we use the word culture. So, before I get started, I want to give you a minute to just think about what you think culture means. So I'm going to ask you to actually pause the video for a second and just write down everything that comes to mind. What did you come up with? Did you notice any kinds of categories emerging? Any kinds of patterns that you saw? Things that were similar? And while you think about that, I'm going to ask you another question. So I have two images here, but we call the one on the left cultures. We call the other one mold, right? Why? What's different about them? They're both mold. Take a minute to think about it. Jot down some similarities and differences that you see between the two images. You might have noticed that one of them has boundaries around it, and it seems like it's intended to be that way, right? Whereas the other one just kind of happened, got left in the back of the refrigerator too long and somebody forgot about it. In other words, the mold on the left, the one that we find more appealing, is cultivated. And that's really where our current idea of culture comes from. If we go all the way back to the 15th century, the original word was used in reference to things to do with crops and tending fields and cultivation of the earth, right? So if you think of it that way, I have the whole etymology up here, but I don't need you to read the whole thing. What I want you to do is just come away with this sense that culture is a process, that tending to, that constant collective process of what we cultivate that's what becomes culture. And so in cultural studies, we take this a step further. We think of culture as the shared, taken for granted knowledge that enables communication between people. It's something that the things that we do every day, the things that we say that are so normal to us that they seem natural, but actually they've been tended to, right? Cultivated. It's important to remember that culture isn't a collection of things like works of art, novels, TV shows. A lot of times we hear those kinds of things referred to as culture. You might think of cultural institutions. Those are really the products of culture rather than culture itself, which is more the practices that produce it. We say that cultural meanings are produced through language. If you didn't have a language to express meanings, we would live in just a world of kind of random free-floating stuff, right? It's the language that lets us assign meanings to all the stuff in the world. And it's important to note that from a cultural studies perspective, language encompasses all representational systems. So it's spoken words and written words, but it's also images, clothing, facial expressions. What I think is most exciting about this cultural studies idea of culture is that it emphasizes that meanings aren't fixed. They're negotiated, right? The world around us, the stuff in it doesn't have a natural meaning. We give it meaning through these collective processes. And there's always tension and negotiation involved in maintaining meanings. And part of that is because people in more privileged social positions tend to benefit from keeping meanings as stable as possible, right? It's the world as it was when they were born that got them in the position they were in, so why change it? You know, if you think of culture this way, you also realize that power can shift. Because this idea of culture really is drawing from not just, but mainly two scholars, Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall. Raymond Williams was a Welsh-British scholar who was very active in the mid-20th century, and Stuart Hall was a Jamaican-born British scholar who was active right up until he died in 2014. Raymond Williams, he was very much influenced by Marxism, and his work, a lot of his work focused on class and rejecting this dominant elitist idea that culture constituted the best that has been thought and known in the world current everywhere, which is a quote from Matthew Arnold, a Victorian thinker. So he redefined culture, sort of reintroduced this other idea of culture, that it's ordinary or a whole way of life, meaning that everyone, no matter where they fell on the socioeconomic scale, was a cultural producer, not just the people who make the great works of art, the great novels, whatever. Because if you think about it, who decides what's great, right? It's usually the people with the most power in society who decide what good art is. So Stuart Hall came along a little later, very influenced by Williams, also, as a lot of them were, influenced by the work of Marx. He kind of mixed a lot of that together and complicated it with ideas from post-structuralism and post-colonialism. And with a lot of, with several other scholars, he was one of the key founders of what we now know as cultural studies. One of the things that I think is really important to take away from this is that cultural studies is really more of a method of inquiry than a particular subject. What we want to know is how and where shared cultural meanings are produced and how they circulate, why some meanings carry more weight or power than others, and so on. And I think that that idea of power needs to always be present in any kind of cultural studies investigation. If you're not looking at issues of power, you're not doing cultural studies. So I want to just briefly, before I end here, introduce you to what I think is a really useful tool for analyzing cultural objects. It was developed by Stuart Hall and several co-authors. And what I like about it is that it really emphasizes this process idea of what culture is. There's arrows connecting each point, and then there's another set of arrows that connects, further connects multiple points together. So there's interactions and movement. The idea is that you can't really look at any object of culture from just one of these points on the circuit, or even just two of them. Like if you wanted to understand a movie and you wanted to understand it in terms of representation and identity, that's great. That's what we do a lot in cultural studies, actually. But in order to really understand it and to understand how power is operating through it, you also have to look at things like production, who made it, where'd the money come from, what are the actual physical materials that go into making it, who's consuming it, who's the target audience, how are they consuming it, where are they consuming it, how is it getting to them, regulation, what are the laws surrounding what people can see or what they can't see, and what are the sort of unspoken social norms that might be keeping some people at the center of the screen and other people pushed to the side. It's really a very versatile tool that you can use to think of all kinds of cultural productions. What I would suggest doing next is checking out Stuart Hall's lecture called Representation in the Media, and that'll give you a more in-depth discussion of how culture and representation are fundamentally connected. I hope that that's been a useful, very brief introduction to the idea of culture, and I encourage you to use that just as a starting point and start digging deeper. Thanks.